I call Sue Moroney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Pleasure to rise and speak on the Employment Standards Legislation Bill, and finding ourselves at this stage supporting the bill at this point, and Ian Lees-Galloway has stressed that we've got some discussions to go. But it's interesting to note that this piece of legislation, I think the government almost got too clever for itself, because at the outset they put paid parental leave and positive changes to paid parental leave in this bill, and some changes that they knew that the Labour Party would find difficult to support, that actually continued to have zero-hour contracts in our landscape. And they put them together thinking, that'll corner the Labour Party, won't it? Well, actually what's ended up happening is it's ended up being a real problem for the government, because they've now got paid parental leave changes that they want to get in before the 1st of April this year, and suddenly they found themselves without the numbers to be able to do that because of the shambles that they have created over 0 hours contracts. So I think, Mr Woodhouse, that's what's being called being too clever for yourself and being hoisted by one's own petard. And I think that's one of the things that's occurred during this process. Mr Speaker, I do want to briefly speak about the 0 hour contracts issue, because it is important that we get that right. If we do not get that right, then people's lives suffer. Their family lives suffer, their ability to be involved with their community suffers, their ability to even be able to get a loan or a mortgage or anything of that nature suffers if they cannot show that they have constant work, what the value of that work is, and therefore not even able to take a mortgage out. I want to particularly thank the excellent submissions that we had on this particular issue around zero-hour contracts, because I think it was the submitters and I think the fine work from the Labour Party as well that really showed the stupidity of the way that the law had been drafted as it had been put into the Select Committee. Because there were many submitters who came in on this issue, and the ones that really stick in my mind were the employers. The employers who one would have imagined were the ones that probably wanted 0 hour contracts. So those operating in the home care sector, for example, where sometimes the scheduling of work can be a little problematic and a little difficult to anticipate who's going to need home care when, and who's going to go into hospital and not maybe need someone come to their home, those sorts of issues. But it was those very employers who actually told the committee they didn't need or want 0 hours contracts. And that had the National Party looking pretty grim, I've got to say, because their reason for keeping some ability to have 0 hours contracts in the law was slipping away before their eyes at the Select Committee. But still, they refused to believe it. Employer group after employer group after employer group came in and, under questioning from the Labour Party, told us that all they needed for flexibility in the labour market and sort of labour market they needed to deliver the goods and services that they were involved in was permanent part-time workforce who they knew were there on particular days of the week. They needed the ability to have fixed-term contracts, which are in the law already, the ability for when they had particular projects on that were unusual or particular high demands for their product or services that they could bring people in on fixed-term contracts. And the only other thing they needed was a genuine ability to employ people on a casual basis. They did not need 0 hour contracts. And so it was the employers and the employees who came along and told us that this is a nonsense, it's creating havoc on people's lives, and employers didn't need it. It was right there and then that the National Party should have addressed this, but they haven't. They got all the way through the Select Committee, the bill's been reported back, still with 0 hour contracts provisions in there, and if they had listened to the Labour Party from the outset, we would have had a bill that made sense, that actually improved people's lives and took people out of that vulnerable situation sitting in front of this House right here, right now. We don't, and I think that's very sad, because the National Party had every opportunity to fix it at an earlier opportunity. Mr Speaker, I now want to move on to the paid parental leave provisions of this bill, because this is the part that Labor can almost wholeheartedly support without any amendments, although we do have one to propose, and I'll talk to that a little later. But the provisions of paid parental leave are generally very good in this bill. It importantly extends paid parental leave to seasonal and casual workers, and that hasn't been available to them before. That provision will be available from the 1st of April. That will make a big difference to the lives of young children born into probably some of our most vulnerable working families, where the income is not regular and where the needs are generally quite high. So I applaud the government for that. But I do want to put on record, the real story behind I think one of the best achievements of this bill that I'm personally very proud of, and that's the extension of paid parental leave, additional paid parental leave to the families who have prematurely born babies. I want to place on record the real story behind that, because the Minister thanked David Seymour, and yes, David Seymour does deserve a little bit of thanking over that. But the Minister should really have been thanking Donnell Ballinger-Taylor. And if he wasn't so churlish, he might have even thanked my good self for my role in this, because here's the story about how this evolved. My bill to extend paid parental leave to 26 weeks was in danger of not progressing any further just after the last election. And in an attempt to salvage that and to do the best that I could and that the Labor Party could for families, I amended the bill in the hopes that the government might find some compassion in their souls to support it. And I amended it in the following way. I amended it so that the 26 weeks paid parental leave would apply to families who had a baby born with a disability, babies whose baby was born prematurely, or a family that had the joy of a multiple birth in their family. Those seem to me, if I was going to amend the bill at all, those were the most pressing needs, and so I did that. You know what, Mr Speaker? That miserable government still didn't support that. They still didn't support even those families having extended paid parental leave. However, I decided that I just needed one more vote to get that through. And I could not look those families in the eye and say that I had not done every single thing possible to try and help their situation out if I didn't go and talk to every member of Parliament I could about securing that one more vote. The person who listened to that plea was David Seymour. So thank you, Mr Seymour. You listened with an open mind about those amendments. You told me that you would support the bill, Mr Seymour, and I was delighted about that. However, I believe that when Mr Seymour went and talked to his coalition partner, the government, they threw their arms up in horror and said, whatever you do, do not support her bill. You cannot support the Labor Party bill. But they promised instead that they would do exactly those amendments in a bill in the government's own name. So it seems like, in a roundabout way, we were going to get what we had asked for anyway. However, that's not the end of the story, because when the bill was brought forward, the Employment Standards Legislation Bill, it didn't have that change in it at all. So the first reading of this bill, there was no additional measure for preterm babies, babies born with disabilities, or babies with multiple births. So I had another conversation with David Seymour. He had another conversation with government, and during the Select Committee process, one of those measures was brought forward. It is an important measure, but I do want to say to the government, you reneged on your promise to Mr Seymour to bring in those three measures. This measure, however, will be very well received by those families that babies born before the end of the 36th week of gestation will have additional paid parental leave, and I feel very proud of that achievement. That will make a big difference to those families. But I particularly want to say thank you to Donnell Ballinger-Taylor. It was her submission on my bill that kept me awake at night thinking about the circumstances of families where the birth had been different to what they had expected and the pressures on their families. So that's an example when someone actually brings a submission forward to Parliament and it makes a big difference. In this case, Danelle, you are a hero for all those families who will benefit from this change.